picture this. You have poured, I mean, maybe a decade of your life into a project.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge sunk cost right there.
Exactly. Like maybe it's a startup or some community organization or just a movement you deeply, deeply believe in. But over the last 2 years, the environment has just turned utterly toxic.
Right. Like fundamentally broken.
Yeah. The leadership is ignoring data. The culture is, actively punishing any dissenting evidence. In fact, anyone who points out the structural flaws gets targeted.
Which is a classic sign of systemic collapse, by the way.
Absolutely. Every rational indicator is flashing red. It's telling you the foundation is crumbling. Yet when you look in the mirror, there's this little voice in your head that says, if I leave now, I'm a quitter.
Yep. The old abandoning the field guilt.
Right. If I walk today, I'm abandoning the cause. Real leaders go down with the ship.
I have to say that narrative is probably one of the most powerful psychological traps in all of human history.
Oh, without a doubt.
We've been socially conditioned across almost every culture, really, to view exit as this massive moral failure. Like, we equate institutional or even relational stubbornness with fortitude.
Yeah, we romanticize it.
We do. The captain going down with the sinking ship is the ultimate hero, even when the ship was poorly designed in the first place and his death achieves literally nothing.
Literally nothing. And so for today's deep dive, we are taking a massive sledgehammer to that exact myth. We're going to look at the actual mechanics of how human civilizations survive.
Because the data tells a completely different story.
It really does. Going down with the ship is, mathematically speaking, a catastrophic squandering of human capital. And to pull this apart, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of source text today.
A foundational document, really, of civilizational survival.
Exactly. Specifically, we're looking at a passage from the Quran, Surah Al-Ankabut, Ayat 26. And we're looking at the deep sociological and thermodynamic frameworks around it.
Which is just such a vital historical and sociological moment to capture. It recounts this huge turning point involving the figure of Abraham.
Right.
The text basically states, Lut believed him, and Abraham said, I am a muhajir to my Lord. And then it describes the governing authority as the mighty, the wise.
But before we go any further, let's establish the ground rules for today, right up front.
Oh, definitely. We need to be clear on our lens here.
Yeah, because we are stripping away all theological sentimentality. We are not in any way reading this as a religious sermon today.
Zero preaching. None.
We are putting on our systems engineering hats for this one. We're reading this strictly through the lens of sociology, the thermodynamics of human energy, and the cold, hard mechanics of societal growth versus societal collapse.
Because when you look at it that way, what this text is actually offering is a literal masterclass in recognizing a sunk cost.
Yes.
It's about identifying that precise moment when a leader realizes that staying in a violently closed system is no longer a virtue. It's a mathematical error.
Right, it's a bad equation. So the core thesis we're pulling out today is that this concept of Hijrah, which usually just gets translated broadly as migration, is framed here not as surrender, but as a highly strategic relocation.
A calculated movement.
Exactly. It's moving toward a permissive environment where your foundational principle can actually be built. When an operating system is flawed, and it starts answering logical evidence with literal or systemic violence,
Then exit becomes the only rational move to preserve the reform itself.
Okay, so let's start by analyzing the vocabulary here.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the English language sometimes totally fails to capture the systemic weight of these concepts.
That completely flattens it.
It does. When modern English speakers hear about someone fleeing a hostile environment, the very first word that pops into our heads is refugee.
Right.
And refugee carries this very specific, honestly tragic connotation. It implies aimless flight, like desperation. You're running out of a burning building in a panic, carrying whatever you can grab, just hoping to survive the night.
But the text doesn't use a word that equates to refugee. It uses the word muhajir.
Muhajir. Break that down for us.
So a linguistic analysis of the root word muhajir, which comes from the Arabic root hjr, reveals this fundamentally different psychological and honestly strategic state.
How so?
Well, the root implies a deliberate severing of ties from one established order for the explicit purpose of moving toward another. It denotes calculation.
Oh, so it's not a panic response.
Not at all. A muhajir isn't someone just swept away by the tides of conflict. It's an individual executing a highly strategic transfer of assets.
I love that framing. Think about it in the context of, like, venture capital or portfolio management.
Yes, exactly.
You have capital. But in this scenario, your capital is your ideas, it's your human resources, your intellectual property, your blueprint for a better society.
Right, your systemic reform.
Yeah. And you look at your current market, the system you're operating in right now, and you realize, oh, wow, this is collapsing. It's a hostile market. Staying here and continuing to invest your capital is just a terrible investment.
Throwing good money after bad.
Exactly. So being a muhajir is the act of liquidating your assets in that dead market and moving them to an emerging market where the environment actually allows them to compound.
To generate a return.
Yes. It's a strategic pivot.
And the text actually defines this destination market with remarkable specificity. Abraham's declaration is, I am a muhajir to my Lord. Or in the Arabic, Ayat Rabbi.
Ayat Rabbi.
Yeah. And if we look at this strictly sociologically and just strip away all the mystical preconceptions, the text itself clarifies in other areas that this does not mean the deity is physical localized.
Right. It's not like God is sitting at some specific GPS coordinate waiting for Abraham to show up.
Yeah, he's not packing his bags and saying, I'm walking to this specific valley because the governing deity resides in a tent over there.
That would be absurd.
Exactly. So Ayat Rabbi translates more accurately to moving toward the sustainer, or moving toward alignment with a governing principle.
Alignment. So the destination is defined by systemic alignment, not geography.
Correct. It means seeking out a favorable, permissive atmosphere where a new revolution can actually breathe. You're migrating toward a state of alignment with universal laws of growth, rather than just wasting your energy fighting a system that fundamentally violates those laws.
Which brings us to this really fascinating detail in the text regarding the very first adopter. Because before Abraham makes the strategic exit, the verse specifically notes, Lut believed him.
Amanallahu.
Right, he secures a convert, a follower. From a purely sociological standpoint, why does the source bother to point this out right before the big migration?
Because it serves as the ultimate proof of concept.
Proof of concept? Tell me more.
If we view this through systems theory, the inclusion of Lut demonstrates that the reform, the core idea itself, retains its ideological value even as it unmoors from its geographical origin.
So Abraham isn't leaving empty-handed.
Exactly. He has validated his concept in the marketplace of ideas. The human capital has been secured. By highlighting Lut, the text is proving that the ideology isn't intrinsically tied to the soil of that corrupt city. It's tied to the human beings who carry it.
You take the seed with you.
You take a seed with you.
Okay, but I can hear you, the listener, potentially raising an objection right here.
Yeah.
Because that cultural conditioning we talked about earlier, it is deep.
Oh, it's very deep.
You might be listening to this thinking, but wait, isn't there historical and moral value in martyrdom? Doesn't staying to fight the corrupt system, even if it literally destroys you, doesn't that serve as a beacon for future generations?
The whole noble sacrifice narrative.
Right. Like, why is the calculated exit framed as the superior option? It feels almost, I don't know, unheroic to just say, well, the data looks bad, let's pack up.
And that is a very natural reaction.
Yeah.
But the source text actually anticipates that exact tension and addresses it head on. To understand why exit is literally mandated here, you have to look at the mechanism of the host system's response. Because in verse 24 of this same surah, just 2 verses prior, it details exactly how Abraham's society responded to his logical, systemic arguments.
And how did they respond?
They didn't engage in debate. They didn't present a counterthesis. They bypassed the intellect entirely. Yeah. The response was literal violence. The text quotes them saying, kill him or burn him. They constructed a literal fire.
Oh, wow. So they answered a peer-reviewed paper with a flamethrower?
That is exactly what they did. And that right there is the turning point. The engine of reason dictates that staying inside a system that answers logical evidence with physical annihilation is an utter waste of the reformer.
It's pointless.
Completely pointless. There's no nobility in being burned alive if your death extinguishes the very idea you were trying to propagate. When a system crosses that threshold from ideological resistance to physical termination, recognizing that you are in a sunk position is the ultimate triumph of rationality.
This is literally the sunk cost fallacy applied to civilizational survival.
It really is.
I mean, in behavioral economics, the sunk cost fallacy is our tendency to follow through on an endeavor just because we've already invested time, effort, or money into it, right? Regardless of whether the current costs outweigh the benefits.
People do this every single day.
All the time. You spend a decade trying to reform a local political system or trying to salvage a corporate culture where the executive board is actively punishing transparency.
Right.
And you think, man, if I leave now, those 10 years of struggle were wasted.
So you stay for another 10 years.
And now you've lost 20.
Exactly. But the text demands that we operate as master economists of our own human energy. And to prove this, the source draws this brilliant historical and sociological parallel, moving from the story of Abraham to the 23-year mission of the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, let's look at that parallel.
It operates on the exact same thermodynamic principles. Historically, Muhammad spent over a decade, 13 years, in Mecca. He was presenting a massive systemic reform. He was proposing a totally new paradigm of human equality, the dismantling of tribal oligarchy, and the implementation of a unified divine law.
And let's add some serious socioeconomic context to Mecca at that time, because I think people forget it wasn't just a religious debate. Mecca was the financial hub of the entire peninsula.
A massive economic powerhouse.
Yeah. Their economy was largely based on the polytheistic pilgrimage to the Kaaba. The oligarchy in power had an absolute monopoly on the trade routes and the religious tourism.
So when a reformer shows up...
Right, when he shows up saying, actually all humans are equal, the tribal hierarchy is invalid, and oh, by the way, those idols are meaningless, he's not just challenging their theology.
No.
He's threatening their GDP. He is a massive threat to the existing market monopoly.
Which completely explains the intensity of the resistance.
Yeah.
I mean, for 13 years, the friction was continuous and it was violent. The oligarchy utilized economic boycotts, they used physical torture, and systemic marginalization.
And what was the return on investment for those 13 years?
In terms of the number of actual converts in Mecca, it was incredibly small relative to the effort expended. The resistance was entrenched because the system was violently closed.
Which makes sense. I mean, most modern startups operating in a market that hostile would have burned through their runway and folded in, like, 3 years?
Easily.
13 years is an incredible endurance test. But eventually the math just stops making sense.
And so the strategic exit to Medina occurred. And it is vital, absolutely vital to note that historically, the Islamic calendar does not start with Muhammad's birth.
Oh, right.
It doesn't start with his first revolution. The entire calendar, the marking of time for that entire civilization, begins with the Hijrah, the migration.
That is such a staggering detail when you really think about it. The civilization measures its own existence starting from the moment of strategic exit.
Because that relocation was the catalyst for actualization. It was a calculated redeployment to socially, economically, and politically viable ground.
Medina was different.
Very different. It was agriculturally rich, but sociologically fractured by internal tribal warfare. They desperately needed an external arbitrator. They needed a new operating system to unify them.
It was a permissive atmosphere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once the reform relocated to Medina, this massive, complex civilization rapidly materialized in just a decade. The seed finally found fertile soil.
The strategic withdrawal is the specific mechanism that makes the long game possible. I mean, you just cannot scale a product in a market that actively wants to execute your development team.
You have to move the headquarters.
You have to move the headquarters. And the source material codifies this outcome as a universal law of sociology. It introduces this concept it calls the law of requital, or mukafati amal.
Yes. The law of requital is essentially the law of cause and effect applied directly to human sociology and history. It states that actions have inherent, inescapable consequences that just ripple through time.
So it's the ultimate return on investment for the strategic exit.
Exactly.
Let's trace the mechanics of that ROI then. What is the specific requital for Abraham's exit?
Well, the text explicitly notes that because Abraham made this hyper-rational decision to cut his losses, refuse the violently closed system, and redeploy, the systemic requital was multiplication.
Multiplication.
Following his migration, verse 27 states he is granted Isaac and Jacob. Furthermore, he is granted, quote, the book and prophethood in his lineage.
I want to pause on that phrase, the book, because it is so easy to view that as some sort of magical object just dropping out of the sky.
Right, like a glowing tablet.
Exactly. But in the context of systems engineering, what does the book actually represent?
In this analytical framework, the book represents the codification of law. It is the institutionalization of the reform.
Ah, so it's the Constitution.
Yes. Abraham is granted an enduring, compounding line of reform in statecraft. He doesn't just get a new piece of land. He becomes the father of nations. He establishes a systemic empire of ideas that outlasts the Roman, the Persian, and the Babylonian empires.
Wow. The dichotomy there is just striking. I mean, the corrupt order that Abraham left behind, the society that literally built the fire, is doomed.
It stays put, and it's completely static.
Right. It clings to its collapsing fictions, its violent monopolies, and eventually history just buries it under the sand.
Yeah.
But the relocated reform survives. It scales.
It compounds.
It compounds. So step one of civilizational survival is having the profound rationality to know exactly when to pack up your seed and leave the toxic soil.
The preservation of the reform through relocation is indeed step one.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is crucial, the source material is deeply pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Finding fertile ground is only half the equation.
And that is the pivot I was waiting for.
Oh, yeah.
Because migration is how you find the fertile ground, sure, but what determines if your new society actually thrives there once you arrive?
Exactly.
I mean, you can execute a brilliant corporate relocation to the absolute best market in the world, but if your internal mechanics are fundamentally flawed, you're just going to rot from the inside out in a nicer zip code.
Which is exactly where the source material transitions its focus from the macro to the micro. We move from the geopolitics of migration to the internal thermodynamics of a society.
Thermodynamics.
Yes. The text presents this profound analysis of human energy, contrasting two fundamental states of existence, procreation versus creation.
Let's really pull those two concepts apart. Procreation versus creation.
Okay, so the source text argues that basic physical survival, the pursuit of eating, drinking, seeking shelter, and procreating to continue the species, is a purely biological cyclic repetition.
It's the baseline.
It's the baseline operating system of nature. The text refers to this as the animal level of existence. And the defining characteristic of this level is that it cannot elevate itself. It has no upward trajectory.
Right, because an animal doesn't innovate.
Exactly. A lion living on the savannah today operates on the exact same biological firmware as a lion a million years ago. It secures territory, it eats, it mates, it dies, the loop closes, and the next generation runs the exact same script.
So if we map that biological loop onto human society, if a culture or a civilization decides that its absolute highest aspirations are economic survival, material comfort, and having kids to pass down their wealth, they are essentially just hitting the biological repeat button.
The text actually uses highly specific, almost clinical terms to describe societies that trap themselves in this biological loop. It argues they regress to a state called kalanam, which translates to like cattle.
Like cattle.
Yes.
Okay.
This implies operating purely on herd, instinct, consumption, and biological satisfaction. Or it uses another term, as phalasaphilan, which translates to the lowest of the low.
Like cattle. Man, that is an incredibly sharp critique. Especially when you hold it up against our modern definitions of success.
Oh, it completely upends them.
Because we are so deeply conditioned, globally really, to view maximum material comfort as the absolute pinnacle of human achievement.
As the dream.
Right. You get the high-paying job, you buy the large house, you acquire the cars, you ensure your family is financially secure, you retire comfortably, and you die. And we view that as winning the game.
And from a purely biological standpoint, that is indeed success. You have successfully navigated the material environment. But from a civilizational and systemic standpoint, treating biological procreation and material comfort as the ultimate finish line completely halts civilizational evolution.
Because it's still just the loop.
Right. Human life, unlike animal life, contains a different energy architecture. It demands creation. Not just procreation, but creation with a capital C.
Okay, so we're talking about the invention of new systems, the pursuit of intellectual growth, the drive to unlock the mechanics of the universe, to establish higher purposes like universal justice or scientific discovery.
Exactly.
If we just eat, sleep, and reproduce, we are basically maintaining the hardware of humanity without ever writing any new software.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay.
And so the pressing question then becomes, what happens when a society stops writing new software?
What does happen?
What happens when its highest legally and culturally protected goal is merely the unrestricted satisfaction of physical and emotional drives? To answer this, the source introduces a highly specific empirical sociological data point.
Okay.
It brings in the work of the social anthropologist J.D. Unwin, specifically his seminal 1934 book, Sex and Culture.
I want to lean in heavily here because this is where the deep dive transitions from philosophical theory into raw sociological data. And I need to reiterate to you, the listener, the framework we are using today.
Right, the neutrality rule.
Exactly. The concepts we are about to discuss touch on deeply ingrained modern cultural norms regarding freedom and relationships. Our job as your hosts is not to endorse these theories as absolute truth, nor are we here to condemn modern social dynamics.
We are just looking at the mechanics.
Right. Our job is to rigorously unpack the argument the source text is making and to understand the mechanisms it relies on. So, with strict analytical distance, who is J.D. Unwin and what did he find?
Well, J.D. Unwin was a British anthropologist operating out of Oxford and Cambridge in the early 20th century. And he set out to conduct this exhaustive, empirical study of human history to understand the variables that dictate the rise and fall of civilizational energy.
And what was his methodology? Because I know it was massive.
It was incredibly massive in scope. He studied 80 primitive tribes and 16 historical civilizations.
80 tribes.
Yes, 80. And 16 major civilizations, including the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Athenians, and the Romans. His research spanned literally thousands of years.
That's a huge sample size.
Huge. And his specific goal was to understand the correlation between a society's cultural regulations, specifically its boundaries around sexual and emotional drives, and its level of what he called expansive energy.
Expansive energy. How did Unwin define that in a sociological context?
He defined it as the capacity of a society to engage in complex engineering, high-level scientific output, expansive literature, and the ability to organize and maintain a complex empire.
So it's basically the measurable output of a society's intellectual and systemic thrust.
Exactly.
Okay, a sample size of 80 tribes and 16 major civilizations over millennia is just staggering. So what was his conclusion, and how does the source text utilize it?
Unwin's conclusion,
Yeah.
which the source text cites as empirical validation of its own systemic framework, was a sociological bombshell.
A bombshell. Let's hear it.
Unwin posited that he found a direct, unvarying correlation. Societies that remove boundaries on sexual and emotional drives, societies that pursue absolute biological liberty, invariably lose their expansive energy.
Wait, invariably?
According to his data, yes. When a civilization shifts from strict regulations like absolute monogamy to what he called zoistic or entirely deregulated states, they lose their intellectual and creative thrust within just a few generations.
Okay, I have to pause and challenge this right here, because
Right.
from a 21st century perspective, that sounds completely counterintuitive.
It does cut against the grain of modern thought.
Immensely. In our modern paradigm, we generally view the systematic removal of rigid, historical sexual boundaries as the ultimate expression of human emancipation. We view it as throwing off oppressive shackles to allow for true self-actualization.
Yes, the liberation narrative.
Right. We celebrate the dismantling of strict relationship norms as a huge victory for personal liberty. So how does the source, utilizing Unwin, justify the claim that this liberation actually destroys cognitive capacity? What is the actual mechanism at play?
The mechanism they point to is essentially thermodynamic. The argument relies entirely on the concept of sublimation.
Sublimation.
The text, aligning with Unwin, argues that human drives, particularly sexual and emotional drives, are the raw, primary fuel of human psychological energy.
Okay.
When a society treats the immediate, boundaryless satisfaction of these drives as a fundamental right, that raw energy is instantly discharged. There is no friction. There's no delay.
Let me try to translate that into a mechanical analogy, because it sounds like an engine without a casing.
Ooh, go on.
In a combustion engine, the only way you generate the power necessary to move a 2-ton vehicle forward is if the explosions happen inside a tightly bound, heavily regulated metal casing.
Right.
The restriction creates compression, and the compression creates forward thrust. If you just take the casing off and say, let the fire be free, let the energy vent wherever it wants out of a desire for absolute freedom, well, there's no compression.
No.
There's no forward momentum. The energy just dissipates into the ambient air as heat.
That is the perfect mechanical translation of the argument. According to the text, when a society amends commitments, when it treats human partnerships as disposable, when it prioritizes immediate physical release over structural discipline, the civilizational engine loses its compression.
Wow.
The energy dissipates as heat, rather than being sublimated into complex thought.
So the argument is that the frustration of the immediate impulse, the forced discipline of saying, not yet, or only within these boundaries, is what forces the human brain to redirect that massive biological energy into building aqueducts, or writing literature, or discovering calculus.
That is precisely the mechanism the source is outlining.
Yeah.
And it points to what happens to a society when it loses that compression. According to Unwin's historical analysis and the source text's philosophy, the society loses the capacity for complex, systemic thought.
They lose the capacity entirely.
Yes. The Quranic term used to describe this state is la yafkahun, which translates to they do not understand, or more accurately, they lose deep systemic comprehension.
So they lose their grip on cause and effect reasoning.
Yes, the argument is that they become so hyper-focused on the immediate satisfaction of impulse that they lose the capacity for delayed gratification. And delayed gratification is the absolute prerequisite for multi-generational complex thinking.
So they just stop innovating.
They stop innovating. They regress into superstition, seeking magical instant solutions to complex socioeconomic problems. And eventually, inevitably, Unwin's data suggested these deregulated societies are either subjugated or absorbed by more disciplined, highly regulated societies that still have their expansive energy intact.
To reinforce this sociological perspective, the source doesn't just rely on Unwin, though, does it? It brings in other thinkers.
It does. The text cites the work of authors like Robert Briffault. He was a social anthropologist who wrote a massive study on social origins called The Mothers.
The Mothers, right?
Yes, and the text uses Briffault's observations to argue that constantly shifting the definitions of marriage and family structures and removing the boundaries of long-term commitment does not elevate a society. It fragments it. It breaks down the foundational unit of systemic stability.
Again, viewing this purely as an argument being presented to us, it really forces a profound philosophical question.
It does.
What is the actual definition of human freedom? I mean, is true freedom merely the absence of all boundaries? Because if freedom is just the ability to act on any impulse at any time, then a wild animal acting entirely on instinct is the freest creature on Earth.
But we established earlier in the source's framework that the animal is trapped in the cyclic loop, the Kalanem state.
Exactly. It is a slave to its biology.
Right, and the source argues vehemently that true human freedom isn't the absence of boundaries. It is the conscious application of them to preserve human dignity and societal momentum.
Conscious application.
Yes, if humans simply act like animals, pursuing immediate biological release, the text argues we aren't becoming free. We are just changing our master. We are trading submission to a societal or divine law for absolute submission to our own biological impulses.
Which brings us to one of the most brilliant biological observations in the text regarding the difference between humans and the animal kingdom.
The safety valves.
Yes. Think about the physical world. Animals have built-in biological safety valves. They have specific mating seasons. Their drives are naturally genetically regulated by their physical firmware. A lion does not have to consciously choose to regulate itself. Biology literally turns the switch on and off based on the season.
Humans, however, do not possess those biological off switches. We do not have mating seasons. We do not have genetic safety valves that automatically power down our drives when they are no longer necessary for procreation.
Which means we are a perpetual motion machine of desire.
We really are.
If we don't consciously, intentionally regulate ourselves, our drives just run out of control 365 days a year. We are an engine that is constantly injecting fuel into the cylinder.
And that perpetual injection of fuel, if left completely unchecked and unregulated by societal or personal boundaries, consumes the entirety of a population's psychological and social bandwidth.
It just burns everything up.
Exactly. And this is the exact point where the source introduces the concept of kuti.
Let's unpack kuti. How does the text define it?
Kuti translates broadly to selfhood, or the integrated actualized self. It is the psychological architecture of an individual. The expert analysis within the text posits that imposing limits on oneself, consciously saying no to an immediate biological impulse in service of a higher structural goal, is not an artificial restriction of your freedom.
That's not a punishment.
No. It is the very action that builds the architecture of human character.
It is the forging of the metal casing for the engine.
Yes. By controlling these intense perpetual drives through self-imposed conscious boundaries, you fortify the kuti. You strengthen the structural integrity of your own identity. You are taking that raw, volatile, constant biological energy and sublimating it.
You compress it.
You compress it into high-level creative, intellectual, and systemic power. You transition from the animal loop of procreation to the human mandate of creation.
Man, let's pull all of these massive concepts together and summarize the grand arc we have traced today, because it is a lot.
It is a profound framework.
It really is. The text presents civilizational survival as requiring a master-level understanding of where and how to focus human energy. On the macro level, the systemic level, it requires the profound rationality to execute a strategic exit at Hijrah.
Right.
When the system you are in becomes hopelessly toxic, when it answers evidence with violence and fire, you do not stay and burn out of a false sense of loyalty. You recognize the sunk cost. You take your human capital, your validated ideas, and you migrate toward a principle, the Isla Rabbi seeking fertile ground.
That is the macro movement, the preservation of the reform through strategic relocation. But as we've seen, that is only the prerequisite.
Right, phase one. The second phase is the internal thermodynamics. Once
Yeah.
you execute the exit and arrive at that fertile ground, the work changes.
It becomes internal.
Yes. If you squander your human energy on unregulated biological pleasure, if your new society's highest aspiration devolves into mere material comfort and cattle-like consumption, the Kalamam state, you lose your intellectual compression.
According to the text and the sociological data it relies on, a society that refuses to regulate its drives literally loses its mind.
It loses la yafqahun.
Exactly. The ability to comprehend cause and effect. It dissipates its energy as heat instead of forward momentum.
When we synthesize this entire journey, we uncover a fascinating interplay between permanence and change. The permanent principle is that migration toward a governing truth is the ultimate act of preservation. The variables that change are the destinations and the journeys across different eras of history.
The landscape changes, the physics do not.
Perfectly said. Leaving a violently closed system gets you out of the fire, but mastering your internal energy, forging the kuti through intense social and personal discipline, is what actually allows the relocated reform to take root, to compound, and to survive the centuries.
It is a phenomenal reframing of how we think about staying, leaving, and building. We promised a deep dive into the engineering of survival, and the source text delivered a remarkably complex blueprint.
It absolutely did. And as we wrap up our analysis today, I want to turn this directly back to you, the listener. We have talked about empires, prophets, and ancient civilizations, but these mechanisms operate on the micro level of our daily lives right now.
Every single day.
Every day. I want to leave you with the final thought to mull over. Take a hard look at the systems you operate within every single day. Look at your career trajectory. Look at the community organizations you belong to. Look at your professional relationships. Where in your life are you treating a sunk cost as a permanent home?
Where are you staying on the burning ship?
Right. Where are you staying on a sinking ship, convincing yourself it is noble resilience, when the rational, data-driven move is a strategic exit? And perhaps more importantly, if you do find the courage to make that exit, to become a muhajir toward your own higher principles. Once you finally reach that permissive, fertile ground, what raw, dissipated energies within yourself are you willing to discipline and bound?
That's the real test.
Because leaving the fire is only step one. Forging the casing on your own engine is what allows you to stop merely surviving and actually start building your enduring line. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.